Straight seam. Most of the garments are usually made with the most basic and common seam called the straight seam. And it is this simple seam that we are going to learn in this class. Objectives. At the end of this class, you will be able to describe a plain seam, identify a straight seam, sew a straight seam. What is a plain seam? A plain seam is the most common type of seam. It joins two pieces of fabric together, right side to right side, by sewing through both pieces, leaving a seam allowance with raw edges inside the item. The seam allowance usually requires some sort of seam finish to prevent raveling. It is suitable for any type of fabric, woven and knitted. Now let's see one of the basic type of plain seam. The straight seam. What is the straight seam? The straight seam is a plain seam. This is what it looks like. It is the most basic and easiest seam to stitch. The seam allowances can be pressed to one side and finished together in lightweight fabrics, or they are pressed open and finished separately. Now let's see how to do a straight seam on a sample. How to sew a straight seam. You will need the following items to do this sample. Cotton fabric, straight ruler, pattern square, straight pins, measuring tape, tailor's chalk, shears, a pair of small scissors, contrasting thread, iron, sewing machine. Now let's begin. Step 1. Measure, mark and cut out the sample fabric pieces. At the outset, take 2 layers of cotton fabric. Measure and draw 10 by 10 square on it with the help of a ruler, pattern square, measuring tape and a tailor's chalk. Using the shears, cut the marked squares. Step 2. Mark the seam allowance. Now take one of the fabric pieces and lay it on the table with its wrong side up. Using a pattern square, measuring tape and tailor's chalk, mark 1 seam allowance along one of its cut edges. Now pin the 2 pieces with the right side together with the marked seam line on the upper side. Step 3. Stitch the seam. Now we will start stitching. Press the reverse stitch lever and start with the reverse stitch to prevent the seam from opening. Leave the reverse stitch lever and stitch along the seam line with a normal stitch length. Again, press the reverse stitch lever and end with the reverse stitch to prevent the seam from opening. Snip the thread with a pair of small scissors and remove the straight pins. Step 4. Press the seam allowance. Press the seam line with an iron. Then open the fabric and the seam allowance so that the right sides of the fabric are no longer together. Then press the seam open. Finally, you have your sample with the straight seam ready. Please note, here we are using a contrasting thread for demonstration purpose only so that it is visible, but otherwise one would use a thread matching to the fabric. With that, we come to the end of this class. Let's recall what we have learned in this class. A plain seam is the most common type of seam that joins two pieces of fabric together, right side to right side, leaving a seam allowance with raw edges inside the item. For example, the straight seam. The procedure of sewing the straight seam. Let's review its basic steps. Step 1. Measure, mark, and cut out the sample fabric pieces. Step 2. Mark the seam allowance. Step 3. Stitch the seam. Step 4. Press the seam allowance. This is the straight seam. You have now learned all about the straight seam. Take our next class to learn about the double-stitched seam.